them via the Google chat window here at the where the presentation is, and I will address them one by one in there, so everybody will have access to all the information. And here we go. So welcome to this seminar, preparing for the 2015 National Championships at High Altitude. Russ, just give me some feedback of whether it's still working now that I'm back in the, now that I'm in the actual mode here. I'm sending him a text. I'm Sean Wilson. I'm an associate professor at Loma Linda University School of Medicine. I'm also a level 1 coach with USACycling, and I was a professional cyclist, and I'm currently a Category 1 cyclist. Both of my kids race. They're 13 and 14 years old. My degrees are actually in exercise physiology and integrative physiology from UC Davis, and I've done a fellowship in pharmacology at University of Nevada, Reno. My research is actually on the impact of high altitude on the lung. So I'm pretty well versed in high altitude physiology as well as other elements of general physiology and exercise physiology. It's something I love and do every day. So this isn't going to be the only event that I do. I'm going to do a number of these over the next few months, so stay tuned for those, and they will be equally recorded. These are eligible for continuing education units as a cycling coach with USACycling. You can get one unit for this. This one is on high altitude training. I will do them on exercise training and performance. I'll do a multi-week series on training plan design where it'll take about a month to go through, and we'll work through a lot of different elements and allow people to develop their own training plans and share them and get feedback. I will do something on junior specific training. I'll do what is actually what I call medical exercise physiology, which is actually a class in physiology that I teach for this medical students. I will do one on cold, heat, and air pollution, and then I will do something on drugs and sports on anti-doping, which I do very frequently for junior development programs and for the regional ID camps for Barney King and a number of the other ID camp directors. I'm actually in the process of developing a skills and etiquette unit that will have both on-bike and off-bike portions, and then we'll do another one on race tactics. And these are being developed to be dovetailed along with the new beginning racing program that just got released in this last year. This summer, I'm going to be putting together and hosting, along with my family foundation, some summits on junior development. I'll try to do one at the National Road Championships, and then I'll try to do another one at the National Mountain Bike Championships. And I'm trying to work on one for the track championships down here in Carson. And then I'll do 2 regional ones, one in Southern California, probably based right here in Redlands, and then another one in Northern California that I'm hoping that we'll have set up along with the Foxy Fall Century in Davis. In terms of sponsors for this, really I am Wilson. I'm one half of Wilson Cycling. My wife is the other half, Rachel Wilson. This is also sponsored by the Barry and Joyce Wilson Family Foundation. And then we have a new sponsor for our entire club, Don's Bicycles here in Redlands. So I just wanted to make a mention of that. I just want to point out that a lot of the work that I actually do, we take animals to the White Mountain Research Station, which is about 13,000 feet here in California, and it's been run by the University of California for many years. And we actually work on sheep, and there's some sheep in pens down here. I'm showing my cursor, and our sheep are in these pens here, and we actually study them at high altitude. So this talk is actually broken into 2 portions. The first part is going to be physiological basis of altitude and looking at things related to performance and what you can do about it. And then the second part, which will be somewhat shorter, will be talking specifically about how you can prepare for the 2015 Nationals, and the courses were just released in the last few days, and I've gotten copies of those and dropped them into the talk, and we'll talk about each of the courses, which I'm fairly familiar with. I lived in Reno for 5 years, and I've raced and ridden on a lot of the roads that they're using for the national championships. So when traveling to altitude, the big problem is that it reduces the oxygen tension. So this just shows a graph of altitude versus the partial pressure of oxygen. And as you can see, as you go to higher and higher altitudes, the amount of oxygen drops in a curvilinear way. The altitudes that we're dealing with are shown by the red bars here, from about 5,000 feet to about 7,000 feet. And it's what we consider in high altitude physiology, this would be considered a moderate altitude, but yet it still has a lot of effects on the human body. So what altitude is there actually an effect on the human body? Based on the available evidence, it's about 5,000 feet. And really what we see is an increase in the ventilation. And this leads to a number of issues when we talk about how the body actually works, and from a performance standpoint. We'll go through those in a little bit more detail. So the altitudes that we're looking at range from the bottom end of where you would see something at 5,000 feet up to the 7,000 foot level. So you definitely see the influence of altitude on the body at all of these altitudes. When we really talk about high altitude physiology, things like Mount Everest come to mind, where they end up using supplemental oxygen. This is about 29,000 feet. So it's very, very high, much higher than something that we're looking at. And it can actually be hazardous to your health. There's a whole host of things that can go wrong. Some of them are psychological and some of them are physiological. But you can end up dying at very high altitudes. So in terms of the performance decrements that occur at altitude, the first one that I talked about already was an increase in ventilation. Well, the increase in ventilation causes you to blow off. Whoop, the slides are not changing. Are they not changing at all, Russ? Let's see here. Stuck on the first slide. This sometimes has happened. I've seen this happen before. We'll get this sorted. There's workarounds for all of these things. He's getting back to me. Yes, stuck on the first slide. Okay, let me get out of my presentation and get back in here. Let's see here. We're going to fake this a little bit. So now you should be able to see this slide. Yes, Russ? Yes, you can see the slide. Okay. I'm faking this now a little bit from my end. Great. Let's see here. Okay. Should flip to the next slide. Okay, so I'm going to have to, let's see if I can flip between slides easily. Probably not quite as easily as I would like. We'll do it over here on the side window. Okay, so the increase in ventilation actually causes you to lose your ability to buffer lactate, and so that changes your lactate threshold. Basically, you lose your lactate threshold. You basically become more crappy. Is the best way to look at it when you're riding at altitude, and this happens within a couple of days. We'll talk a little bit more about that. The second thing that happens is you can become dehydrated, and when that happens, basically again you lose your ability to pump your blood, and it decreases your VO2 max, which is down at the bottom. And it increases your heart rate and decreases your stroke volume. And these changes can be as much as 15 to 20%, which is extremely bad, right? You're not going to perform as well. Now, this is a real problem for somebody that's coming from sea level and going to altitude. Now, if you already live in Colorado, as you would expect, you're okay. Whereas everybody that comes from sea level, they're at a disadvantage. And so that's what we're trying to overcome. So now in terms of the more downsides of a high altitude, the symptoms of hypoxia as low as about 7,000 feet, and I've even seen it at 5,000 feet in myself and in others, but you can get headaches, fatigue, drowsiness, nausea. I've seen people throwing up on the side of the road. You can get decreases in cognition, and that's why I show the guy dead here on the side of the mountain, is that you don't make as good of decisions. If you go to higher altitudes, you can get what we call acute mountain sickness, or AMS. And really the primary one that you're going to see, and you'll probably see this in Tahoe, is a sleep disturbance. You're not going to sleep as well, and that's a real issue. You know, if you're not sleeping as well, you're not going to perform as well. And so you have to be really careful about that. You can get peripheral edema, the vomiting that I already talked about, shortness of breath, pulmonary edema, cerebral edema, pulmonary hypertension. Probably not going to get so much of those. And then down at the bottom, you can get chronic mountain sickness from being up there for long periods of time. And you can get pulmonary hypertension and a bunch of other things. But usually those things aren't going to happen at the altitudes we're talking about. One of the things that can happen is if you're using hypoxic chambers, and we'll talk about those in a little while, is that at those kind of simulated altitudes, if you're using them for a long period of time, you can get immune suppression, which can lead you to get sick more easily. So when we, let's see, just, okay, so kind of flipping through here, is there an upside to high altitude? And really when we look at the effects of cellular hypoxia, which is what we're talking about, the decrease in oxygen tension, that leads to activation of a variety of different genes in the body that are downstream of what we call hypoxia-inducible factor, HIF1 alpha. And the primary one that we always think of is an increase in red blood cells due to EPO, or erythropoietin. And that's one of the key ones that we always talk about, but there's a whole host of other things that can happen that are actually beneficial to the body. And when we look at those, what you find is that you can increase the ability to actually use oxygen. You can increase the ability to generate energy through glycolysis or anaerobic metabolism. You can have more blood vessels, so you can get more blood out to the muscle, and then you can improve the ability to actually deliver the oxygen by dilating the vessels more, dilating them better. And all of these things are actually happening, but they take time to develop. These things don't happen overnight. So you've decided that you actually want to do altitude training. So how do you actually go about doing this? Well, there's a number of different ways. But when we look at this and we look at the benefits that you might see from this, and this is from a recent review, is that it depends on the individual. So some people, they go to altitude and basically they suck. They have a really hard time and they don't really adapt very well. And I'm one of those people. And in those people, you actually have a clear harmful effect. And on average, this is only about a couple of percent. But a couple of percent when you're trying to compete at your best is the difference between winning and getting dropped a lot of times. And then for another group of people, it's really unclear whether there's going to be any benefit at all. And for them, you know, maybe there's a little bit of good, but it's not really clear. And then there's another group of people that there is actually a clear beneficial role for doing the high altitude training. And in those people, again, the benefit is only by a couple of percent. And in this case, we're talking about somebody going to and doing a high altitude training camp and then figuring that they're going to perform better when they come to sea level. And so this is a little bit different than going up to altitude and trying to adapt to the altitude itself. But in this case, this would be somebody that goes to high altitude and then they want to come down and they want to perform better. But the general rule still applies that some people are going to adapt better than others when they go to high altitude. And this is something to keep in mind. So there's a variety of different techniques for doing altitude training, ranging from living high, training high, which is classic, living high and then training low, which is kind of the in vogue style now. And then there's living low and training high. And we'll go through each of these different models in a little bit more depth so you have a better appreciation for them and what role they might have in terms of being able to prepare you to go and actually do the efforts at altitude and be able to perform well at the national championships. So the first one we're going to go into is living high and training high, which is considered the classic traditional high altitude training camps. And really, this one was designed or came about because it does help athletes acclimatize for doing high altitude events, which is primarily what we're talking about. It's been used since the mid-60s, and when we look at the altitude that you want to go to, it's about 6,500 feet. It's something like going to Tahoe. It's something like going to Deer Valley. And I'll go through some of the different locations that you can go to. So how does performance actually change with altitude? So this kind of shows a mock-up of what happens when you go to altitude and when you're at your best and when you're at your worst. And we'll go through the different phases here. What you find is that when you initially go to altitude, there's a depression in terms of your work performance. You start to drop off. So when we look at this kind of schematic, this graph, you can see that on the y-axis is their capacity to perform, and on the x-axis is time, and this is in days. And so you can see when they first go to high altitude, they basically, their performance drops off. They do shittier and shittier over the first couple of days. And this really depends on the individual, on how quickly they can bounce back from this. And you can see in this case, it takes quite a while before the person really bounces back to their full potential, right? It's slow, what they say is a slow rebound. And they show this over the next few weeks. And you can see these kind of gray lines here. Let's see, can I actually get on there? Yeah, so there's these gray lines, and that kind of shows the range of individual variability from person to person. And so that's something to be very aware of. Oh, let's see. So the recent perspectives on acclimatization, you can see here, you know, TJ Van Garden standing on the podium from the USA Pro Challenge a couple of years ago. And from all practical considerations is that it takes a couple of weeks to actually fully acclimatize. And they say here that you would spend 2 to 4 weeks at high altitude, and you would do this several times during the year so you can not only build up and do better at potentially low altitude, but you can maintain those benefits throughout the years. You have to keep going up there, otherwise it's a use it or lose it kind of thing. So the first phase, we call it the acclimatization phase. It's the first period that you're up there, just the first week or so. And really what they do is you just do easy training. You go up there and you ride easy, you make sure to drink lots of fluids, and that allows your body to make those initial adjustments that happen during the first week. Then there's a primary training phase, and this is the bulk of the time that you're actually going to spend at the altitude. And you do a progressive overload of the system, and you increase the intensity of your work efforts and increase the volume. And one of the things that you have to take into account when you go to altitude and you try to train at altitude is you need to account for the altitude-induced fatigue that I kind of mentioned right at the beginning. Is that because your body isn't able to rebound as fast, you're not able to recover as fast, is you have to give yourself a little more rest in between each of your work efforts. So if you knew that it takes you 24 hours to fully recover from a high intensity workload, maybe it's going to take you 2 days to fully recover. And that's something that's, again, a lot of individual variability, and so you really have to know how your body's going to react in order to be able to go through that. The other key thing is there's really an inability to actually train at sea level intensities. So you have to cut back on the overall training load. You're not going to be able to go as hard, and you're not going to be able to do quite as many efforts. You're going to have to reduce the total workload for each individual ride that you actually do. So maybe you have to decrease the interval durations and maybe increase the rest between each interval. Maybe you have to decrease the number of total intervals that you do. Somehow you're going to have to reduce the work effort. And overall, by doing this, it's going to allow you to make more long-lasting physiological adjustments to the body, as opposed to breaking it down and then you're not able to perform as well. In a traditional high-altitude training camp, at the end of the training camp, you would have some sort of recovery phase right at the end of the camp, and you would have reduced intensity. You'd do low-intensity work, decrease the intensity, decrease the volume of the work efforts, basically take it easy for a couple of days right at the end before you go to sea level. And then the anticipation is that's going to improve your performance when you go to low altitude. But in this case, you're going to be at your peak performance when you're actually racing at high altitude. In terms of the physiological responses to when you come back to low altitude, it's the opposite of the ascent. I talked about how you have changes in your blood pH, and you lose the buffer capacity, so you're unable to buffer the lactate as well. But your pH normalizes, you have a decrease in the ventilation, and then possibly you have an increase in your VO2 max, and then over time you're going to lose those red blood cells. So when we think about those performance changes on return to low altitude, I talked about how there can be people that become worse off when they go to altitude. You have people that actually there seems to be no benefit, and then you have these other people that that they have a clear benefit when they come back to low altitude. And here, they kind of show that you would do your competition very close to the time that you come back to low altitude, but they talk about there's 3 different phases to the re-acclimatization phase. But there can be a huge variation. You can see the variability from individual to individual, and it's very, very large. So in the first phase, it's been noted that some athletes perform a lot better when they come to low altitude, and they have their best performances. But that's clearly not everybody. But then when they start training, again, they go back into some sort of normal training plan, whatever it is. There's a potential that they may lose their performance for about 10 days. And they call it here an unstable phase, where the person's kind of re-equilibrating. And then about 2 to 3 weeks after they return to low altitude, they may have their best performance. But again, that's not everybody. So when we go to the newer models of living high and training low, so this would be somebody that maybe lives in a high altitude area all the time, and then they come to low altitude to do certain types of workloads. So that would be the natural terrestrial here on the left-hand side. You can also use things like the nitrogen dilution, oxygen filtration type of techniques. You can do things with the high altitude tents. So you can basically sleep in a tent and then go outside and then do your workloads. Or you can live at high altitude. You could live at Colorado Springs and then use supplemental oxygen during certain types of work efforts, during certain types of intervals, and that should help you to be able to do the work bouts at a much higher intensity than you would otherwise. So this has been used since the early 90s, and it's been used in a number of elite athletes, Olympians, and non-elite athletes, and it's been shown to be beneficial. And the enhancements actually seem to be most prevalent in the shorter events, things that are between 4 to 10 minutes. So a key one in cycling would be the 4,000 meter pursuit, something on the track. It's probably less important for long duration events. Some studies actually show that there's an effect, but most of those studies were poorly controlled and the data is fairly inconclusive. There has been some anecdotal evidence from the Olympic marathon runners who have done this, but again, most of this is anecdotal at this point. There's some controversy over the exact physiological mechanisms that are at work, but the primary emphasis has been placed on the red blood cell production, enhancements in red blood cell production that go along with the erythropoiesis due to the EPO, or erythropoietin. But the secondary physiological changes are arguably similarly important. There's changes in the ability to buffer the lactate that's produced, so there's an increase in the muscle buffer capacity. There's possibly alterations in the ability to use oxygen at the level of the mitochondria, so maybe they're becoming more efficient. Maybe there's more mitochondria. They have more enzymes that are involved in the oxidative phosphorylation steps, and these things could be important, but it's still fairly controversial on exactly what's happening. The performance gains, they're potentially as much as 2%. Again, not everybody's going to respond well. The VO2 max gains, they might be on the order of 4%, which is fairly significant for doing something that's not really a long period of time at high altitude. But again, this has to be living high, training low. So in terms of a practical consideration of doing this, really you're going to want to stay at high altitude for at least 4 weeks for 22 hours a day at 6,500 to about 8,000 feet. So you're going to want to do your high intensity training at a much lower elevation at about 5,000, or even better yet, the lowest you can possibly get. The classic example where a lot of these studies were done were people living in Deer Valley, which is about 6,500 feet, and then they would drive down to Salt Lake City to do their high intensity workouts, which is about a 45-minute drive. In California, you have the ability to live in Mammoth at 7,900 feet or even higher, and then training in Bishop, which is also about a 45-minute drive, and that's at about 4,000 feet. So that's a very ideal situation, and I think they've used that for some of the Olympic running studies. And then other possibilities is here near Redlands is you could live in Big Bear, which is 6,700 feet, and drive down to Redlands, which is at 1,500 feet. So huge, you have a huge differential there in terms of your altitudes, and it's only about an hour drive. Or you can drive down the backside into the desert to 4,000 feet at Apple Valley, and that's about a 45-minute drive. Another option is to live in like North Lake Tahoe at about 6,000 feet, and then train in Reno, which is at 4,000, and that's about an hour drive as well. So those are all very good possibilities for doing those kinds of things, but it's a huge time commitment. You're basically training all the time. Doing simulated high altitude chambers, this is a Hypoxico tent, I believe, is that for all practical considerations for simulated altitudes, you have to go to a higher altitude than you would if you were doing it terrestrial or all natural. You have to go up to about 9,000 feet. And you have to spend 12 to 16 hours a day. If you're just sleeping in the tent, it's really not enough. You have to be spending more time in the tent. So you better like hanging out in your tent and reading books and watching TV and doing homework or whatever in the tent. That's where you need to spend most of your time, because just sleeping in there is not enough. In this case, they show another type of situation where you can actually hook up a whole chamber and do an actual room in a house, and that's a fairly good way of doing it. So you need, when you're doing these simulated altitudes, if you're lower than about 6,200 feet, it won't induce the EPO production. And as I said, the EPO production and the increase in red blood cells that go with it is one of the key factors that they think is involved in the increase in performance. And so that really has to happen. You have to be at a fairly high altitude for that to happen. And in terms of how long you have to do this, it has to be 3 weeks or so in order to get those secondary responses. The ventilatory responses happen much more quickly than that, within about 2 weeks, and we'll go into that in a little more depth. So when we talk about doing the supplemental oxygen, So if you live at about 6,500 feet, like Colorado Springs or at Lake Tahoe or something like that, and then what you do is you do moderate intensity rides at altitude, and then if you're going to do your high intensity intervals, then you're going to breathe supplemental oxygen, such as somebody shown here on a bike, and then they're breathing supplemental oxygen to actually simulate the sea level environment. So it actually allows you to work harder than you would otherwise at the high altitude. So the last one here is basically living low and training high. And there's actually two different models. And I know that a lot of people are starting to use these kind of models because it's actually fairly easy to do. Is if you live here in Redlands, you can find somebody that has a chamber. I know that there's physical therapy groups and things like that that have these chambers, and they do something that's called intermittent hypoxic exposures, IHE, or intermittent hypoxic training, IHT. And they have slightly different mechanisms of action on the body and slightly different efficacies of actually working. So I've already said what they are. Theoretically, it's supposed to stimulate the HIF-1 alpha, the hypoxic-induced factor that I talked about a while ago, that can stimulate the EPO, increase the erythropoiesis, and increase the red blood cell number, increase your mitochondria, increase your capillary density, and possibly increase your muscle fiber cross-sectional area. In theory, in practice, it may not be working quite so well. So how they work, the intermittent hypoxic exposures, basically you're sitting at altitude, right? This guy's sitting in a chair, breathing hypoxic gas, and you're simulating 13,000 to 15,000 feet in this case, very, very high, and it can range from doing 5-minute on, 5-minute off for a couple hours to just breathing basically a hypoxic gas mixture for several hours, 180 minutes. A lot of times they do this for 3 sessions per week, and then you do this for multiple weeks. Overall, the evidence is underwhelming. It's not really been shown scientifically to have any benefit in terms of performance at low altitude. Living low and training high, so actually doing high intensity work on the bike, intermittent hypoxic training on the bike, is that again, you do the same kind of thing, the same kind of gas mixtures, same kind of periods of time, but now what you're doing is you're doing either low intensity work, 60–70% of your heart rate reserve for, it's a sub-threshold pace for 90 to 120 minutes, and then you do maximum intensity effort. The scientific evidence is still controversial. There's potential improvements in capacity at high altitude. There's been a number of manuscripts that have come out just recently that have looked at this, like in soccer players, and they're actually finding that there can be a possible increase in a person's sprinting ability to be able to do repeated efforts at very high intensities. It doesn't look like there's any change in VO2 max or power outputs. There's possibly increases in those secondary responses that I talked about in terms of possible changes in the ability to buffer the lactate, possible changes in how the mitochondria function. But this work is still ongoing and it's still controversial. So in 2010, there was a proposal put forward in terms of doing this intermittent hypoxic training, doing it a couple of times per week, 30 to 45 minutes of high intensity at about 9,000 feet, and then doing threshold intervals of 10 to 20 minutes. And then also combining that with doing the intermittent hypoxic exposures. And again, this is still controversial, and this again is for low altitude performance for the most part. And we'll talk about how this can possibly interface with your ability to prepare yourself to go to high altitude. So there's ways of mixing all these things together, living low, training low, and then doing high altitude efforts and things like that. And again, it gets more complex when you do things like that. And in theory, these things can help you to improve your performance, but again, it's very controversial. And this is just to illustrate the point, and this is from the manuscript of how to actually put these kinds of things together. And I'm not going to go into the details of that, but when you ask me, I can give you the entire talk, and then you'll be able to look at these slides in more depth. Or you can just go and download the manuscript yourself. They actually break down all the potential variations in terms of how to do the hypoxic training and how to improve, possibly improve performance. So what if there's actually no time to acclimatize for high altitude events? So remember that the athlete is at their worst at 1 to 3 days at altitude. So potentially, you could use those hypoxic tents that I talked about to actually simulate altitude, or perform the intermittent hypoxic exposures, the intermittent hypoxic training sessions to help prepare you. And the idea there is that something is better than nothing at all. And that's just something to keep in mind. That something is going to be better than nothing at all. How much help it's really going to have is controversial. So that's just something to keep in mind. If you cannot do anything at all, you know that there is no way for you to get to the national championships until the night before. You want to show up as close to the event as possible. And the main thing is you want to stay hydrated. One of the key things that happens is that you actually pee out a whole bunch of fluid. And along with that, you lose the bicarbonate buffering that buffers the lactate. And so you have to stay hydrated. Another thing is don't panic. You're not going to be performing at your best. Hopefully you've been to altitude before, so you know what you're up against. For me, I tend to hyperventilate a lot at high altitudes, and it's because of just my ventilatory response. And I have to understand that that's what's happening, and I just can't panic. And I have to know where my threshold is, right? Because I know that my threshold has become worse, and I have to compensate for that from a performance standpoint, so I don't blow myself apart. And just hope for the best. So this just shows a few high altitude training destinations and some variety of camps that exist. So this is more for the future. I don't know that you're going to be able to do this between now and nationals because it's a very short time period. So in terms of the acclimatization strategies, and this is from a very recent review, it basically reviews all that scientific literature that we've gone through, and it puts things into a very practical context. So in terms of the acclimatization strategies, pro and con, the first thing is to modify your time of arrival. We talked about arriving just before the event. You can arrive in a week, a couple days to a week up to the event. You can go 2 weeks before the event, or there's permanent residence, basically 3 months. And then there's different strategies for pre-acclimatization, the intermittent hypoxic exposures, intermittent hypoxic training, and then there's always blood doping. But we'll take blood doping off the table because we know it's unethical. Even though we'll talk about it in a little more depth. So what I call a show and go, show up to the event, be as close as possible. What we talk about is actually trying to drive from a low altitude to the high altitude the morning of the event, get there as close as possible to the event, stay hydrated. The positive things, very low cost, it's easier logistically, and it minimizes that plasma volume loss or the hydration problem. And then it may avoid some of those acute mountain sickness problems, especially if you're sleeping up there for multiple days and you really suck at sleeping up there and you're vomiting and all the other bad things that kind of go with that. The negative aspects, well, you don't get any positive acclimatization response. And if you're up there for more than about just like 16 hours, you could suck big time. It could be your worst possible race ever. So it has a lot of problems with it. Short stays, here the idea is that the longer you stay there, the more you're going to improve. It's slow adaptation, but each day you're going to have an improvement. And the primary one that we talk about is ventilatory acclimatization, and you have diminished acute mountain sickness problems. You know, the real key one again is those dehydration problems, and then the sleeping and nausea type things. The negative aspect, it increases the costs, right? It increases the logistics, and just being up there for a short period isn't as good as being up there for 14 days. You really want to be up there for 14 days or longer, and we'll talk about why in just a second. So a 14-day stay or longer, you get a near maximal performance versus just an acute exposure to altitude. And it minimizes all those acute mountain sickness problems. The negative component is that there's significant costs and logistics associated with it. And secondarily to that, we've talked about how you have to modify your training when you go to high altitude and you're doing a high altitude training camp, is that you depress your training quality when you go to high altitude. And from a coaching perspective, this is going to be balanced by the taper, and we'll talk about specifically how to train as you go up to nationals and how this type of stay at high altitude can actually help you in terms of your overall performance at the national championships. Permanent residence is the best way to go, right? It reduces the impact of going even higher, and for me, I love the mountains, so it'd be great to be able to do that. But my job isn't in the mountains. My job is at low altitude, so I live at low altitude. I have a job at low altitude, not at high altitude. So that's one of the big negative things is, have you got a job up there? Is it someplace that you can live? If you're a professional athlete, not such a big deal. If you're a leech and you live on your friend's couch, it's probably not a big deal either. But it's unknown how this is going to impact your overall training load. Some people are going to adapt well and they're going to be able to train at very high intensities at high altitude, and other people, maybe not so much. Maybe they're going to just have a terrible time in terms of being able to do the high intensity work that they need to do in order to perform at their best. The intermittent hypoxic exposures, if we go back to this, doing an altitude tent, 8 to 12 hours a day minimum in an altitude tent, and then 5 minutes on, 5 minutes off type thing for 90 minutes or up to 180 minutes total time. You can live and train at home. You could do it here in Redlands, you could do it out at the beach or whatever. Short daily time investment, and you're likely to actually get those ventilatory responses that are actually really a problem when you're at high altitude. Those things can actually help with the ventilatory acclimatization. It doesn't impact your performance based on all the available evidence, and it doesn't seem to affect your acute mountain sickness problems when you actually do travel there. So those are the trade-offs. So there can be, a lot of costs associated with doing things like this too. So if you have free access, maybe it's worthwhile. You go there, read a book, do homework or something while you're doing this, and maybe it's a good thing. Intermittent hypoxic training. The positive thing is there possibly is an improved VO2 max and power at altitude when you do these kinds of things. That has been shown in the literature, and there can be a large cost in logistics for hypoxic gases. The places that are set up for intermittent hypoxic exposures, they may not be set up for doing it when you're doing high intensity work, because the types of chambers and things like that need to be modified in different ways to be able to give you the gases properly. Blood doping, well, it lessens your VO2 max declines up to about 3,500 meters. Basically, it helps you when you go to high altitude up to about 3,500 meters. It doesn't seem to actually prevent problems above 4,100 meters, which is very, very high. As we said, it's unethical. You're going to be sanctioned for it, and then there's a whole host of health effects. So this one's off the table. But I just wanted to make sure for completeness to discuss it. In summary, high altitude acclimatization is most critical for doing events at altitude. Proper acclimatization really takes a couple of weeks, if not longer, to occur. Going to elevation has risks associated with it. If you're going to the national championships, you don't have a choice. So the more acclimatization you can get, the better. You're going to have to reduce your training intensity to compensate for the low oxygen tension. So that's something to keep in mind when you're up there. Living high and training low actually has a scientific basis to it. And there's not as many high-quality studies on cyclists. Most of them are done on runners. There's scientific basis for short-duration efforts for pursuiters, and the benefits seem to be short-lived, and potentially they're smaller variable. This is when you're coming down to low altitude to do your maximal performance. There's anecdotal evidence for longer duration events. Other models have less scientific basis. Intermittent hypoxia, whether it's during training or just sitting there, it remains very unclear. And there's huge amounts of variability between individual athletes. And all these things carry some sort of expense with them. So what? I've just talked about all these scientific things. So what? What does this have to do with the national championships? How do I actually prepare for the nationals? What's actually going to help me when I go and race at a high altitude? I've provided a lot of scientific mumbo jumbo about how these things may or may not actually help you. So what actually should you do in order to be at your best? How do you actually train? So when you're training and peaking for nationals, and this is true for any type of event, for any type of maximal or peaking event, is you have a building period where you build volume and intensity. You have a tapering period where you change your intensity and your recovery. You then have your peak race, and then you recover from that. And this just kind of shows the peaking cycle. You have a build phase for several weeks. So this shows training load here on the y-axis, and then the number of weeks across the x-axis. And then in green, I show volume, and then in red, I show the intensity, and I use a 5-point scale for each one of them, so they're relative to yourself, where you start from a low intensity and low volume base, and then you build your volume and intensity over a period of weeks, and you work with your coach to find what the right balance is between those. And then you have this taper phase, and then you should peak. And we'll go through each of these. So during this peaking cycle, the longest rides, just to keep in mind, especially if you're being coached by somebody, they'll be working with you on this. But if you're doing this on your own, the longest rides that you should be doing are somewhere between 80 and 120% of your actual race time. If your race is only 2 hours, you don't need to be doing 5-hour rides. They're too long. They're going to make you slow. If you're doing large volume like that, you want to stay more on the shorter duration things and maybe higher intensity. The intensity of your workouts should mimic the type of race that you're trying to get ready for. And as you can see, that this takes many weeks, and that's why I'm presenting this today. We are about 8 weeks from the national championships, which puts us almost at week 1 of this peaking cycle. And you don't want to forget to work on your weaknesses. And we'll go through the different courses at the national championships, and you'll see that when you look at those courses that you may have some weak areas for that specific type of course, and you may want to try to work on that. And you have plenty of time to do that between now and the national championships. So when we look at this, when we look at the performance that you should have, the performance gains, what you find is that your performance should increase a little bit each week. From the first week, you're at maybe a modest level of performance, and then you have performance gains over a period of few weeks, and then you're at your max performance when you hit your peak here after your taper. And you can actually see during the tapering phase is you see large increments in terms of your performance gains, and not as much maybe during your build phase. So you have to be patient. You have to be patient with the workouts that you're doing, that things will come as you prepare. So when should you actually travel to altitude? It should be during that tapering phase. I talked about how when you go to altitude, you probably have to back off on your intensity, and you probably have to change your recovery. And so during your taper phase that's when you're going to be making those changes. And so initially during your tapering phase, I show here decreasing your volume and boosting your intensity. Well, maybe you don't go during the first part of that week where you're trying to do those ultra high intensity workouts that are really trying to drive your peak. and drive your maximal performance. Maybe you go towards the end of the week when you're maybe starting into a recovery mode, and we'll go into specific dates in a minute. And then during the second week, you're doing a lot more recovery and you're hanging out. And if you're in the Tahoe area, you can go to the beach. The beach is really cool there. There's plenty of cool things to do around the area, and you're taking a lot more rest time. But it's not all going to be fun and games, because you're going to have stuff that you need to do while you're up there. And we'll go through a timeline of what you need to do while you're there. So here's a sample national road itinerary. I kind of chose the U23 road race. Time trial and criterium events. Basically, you got to be ready June 24th, 2 months from today. So how do you get there? Well, the first thing, in the next 2 weeks from now, get your bike overhauled. Make sure that puppy's ready to go. You don't want cables breaking on you. You don't want your wheels blowing apart. You don't want your bottom bracket dropping out. I've seen these things happen at the race course. They are unacceptable. Those things need to be taken care of now. You want to get yourself registered. The registration is opening. It may even be open right now. Get yourself registered. Get yourselves housing arrangements. Get your travel arrangements in order. I got my housing arrangements in order today. I have a friend who's loaning us a house for the week. I wasn't sure that was going to happen. I was getting a hold of him the last few days, and I was being persistent. And he finally said today, yes, you can use the house. If he said no, that would have been fine too, but I would have rented a house by the end of the weekend. Download the course profiles. I've done that. I show them on here. I give you the site here to go to. And I want to thank David Huntsman for actually sending that link to me last night, because we've been looking for this for a couple of weeks. You want to start thinking about key aspects of each course, and I'm going to go through that just on my cursory overlook of those courses and my knowledge of the area, because I live there. And then you want to start thinking about your equipment and gearing decisions. And then there's some other things that we can talk about. So here's a sample itinerary in terms of a pre-race taper. So backing up from the time of the event, June 24th, going back about 2 weeks, and I say Monday, June 8th to Friday, June 12th, sometime in there is your taper phase for the first week. Short duration, very high intensity efforts. And then you want to do all of those things, all of those types of rides before you actually arrive at altitude. Because once you arrive at altitude, if you're still trying to do those very high intensity work efforts, you're going to suck. It's going to feel like crap, and you're going to ride slow, and you're going to be unhappy. And so you want to try to get those things done. You want to try to get those things done at low altitude. The second thing is as soon as you get up there, you want to just be doing recovery rides. You do not want to do high intensity work efforts the first couple of days at altitude. I've known this since I was like 15. Going to altitude, you go up to altitude, you feel like dirt, and you go slow for a couple of days. And so you're going to make those initial ventilatory adjustments during those couple of days. Each person's different, so I say 2 days approximately. But if you suck at altitude and you have a hard time acclimatizing, and you already know that, get up there earlier. If you don't know, you're going to have to cross your fingers and go with the best guess, which is about 2 days. During the second week and even during the first week, you want to do course recons. You want to go out and ride the individual courses. And there's a lot of elements to those courses, and you really want to see them. There's a lot of things going on. Those rides should be shorter duration. And in some cases, you may have to break up the ride over a couple of days because they're point-to-point races. They're shorter duration rides, high intensity, some with high intensity efforts, and a lot of recovery. And possibly, you have to remember, I'm just keep throwing it back out there, possibly you're going to have a decrease in power due to the high altitude. You want to adjust your efforts accordingly. And if you're training by heart rate, you can almost throw that out the window, because it's going to be hard to train by heart rate, because you're going to have all these heart rate issues because you've lost a lot of volume, because you've peed it all out. Got to stay hydrated. For me, I love Nevada City. I've always loved Nevada City. Great race. I would say if you love that type of race, drive down from Tahoe. It's only about an hour. It's a lot of fun. Huge crowds. Go do the race. You should have enough time to recover between Sunday and Wednesday. It's only about an hour and a half, right? Can't be that hard. But at any rate, right after that, you've done Nevada City. You know, on Monday, the 22nd, you go out and re-preview the road race course, which is the first thing that's coming up. Tuesday, you do a race preparation ride. In the evening, you prepare all your food and bottles for the race. Everything's good to go. You make sure that all your management's in place. You know what you're doing for the next day. So I'm going to start off, and I'm going to show just here. I'm going to show the 13-14 race to start with. It's a 5K loop, and it has a 50-meter climb that may or may not allow for a field split. You know, it's in a completely different location than the other races. I don't know the roads right there, but it's at the top of Donner Pass. It's a very high altitude. I think it's over 7,000 feet there, at least. Rachel's telling me it's at least 7,000, if not higher. And you know, based on the type of elevation and the type of climb it is, I bet there'll be a field split. So then for the 15, 16, and 17, 18s, okay. So it's a little hard to see on this map here, but you actually start, the registration is here, and 70K away is the start line. Well, actually, the start line for that is, the start and finish is 70K away from the finish, and we'll talk about why that's a big deal in a second. So this is 15, 16 men and 17, 18 women. You start out and then you go across what we call Sierraville. It's also where the time trial is. It's dead flat. It's perfectly flat. They're racing wickedly early in the morning, which we'll talk about as a problem. And then you have a climb and then some bumps, and then you have a final climb up to North Star. So why is this an issue? The Loyalton start is a point-to-point race. It's way out in the boondocks. It's an hour away from North Star. It's an hour away from the finish. And if you're staying in Truckee, it's still about 45 minutes. And since the start time is 7:30 in the morning, and the packet pickup is even earlier than that, I don't know what to say. I mean, you're going to have to get up and get out the door at about 5:30 to get out there. It's flat for 20K until the 89 junction, and then you have the main climb. So theoretically, if you get out there wickedly early, you know, and you don't have time for a real warm up, then who cares? You just warm up across the flats for 20K before you get up to the climb. But it can also be cold because it's at altitude, and that's another issue. So it can be wickedly cold that early in the morning, and you can be freezing going across the flats. Then you have that main climb, and then there's bumps until the final climb at North Star. I'm also going to throw this out there that, as far as I know, there hasn't been a race out there since the early 80s, which was when I was out there, and there were issues with that, and we'll just leave it at that. And that's why the courses have not been used since. So I hope it goes better than that. The 17-18s and the U23 women, guess what? They don't start out there. They start in North Star. They start at what would be the finish for the 15-16s. So if you have 15-16s and 17-18s, you can guess what that means. You have to have two sets of people to go to two different locations basically at the same time, because they have to be out there at a little bit later, but basically you have to have two sets of people to run things. So for the 17-18s and the U23 women, it's a North Star start, out and back race. There's major logistics, as I talked about. There's a potential for breaks to get away early, but more likely the separation is going to be on the main climb coming back on 89, and then the final bit into North Star is going to really be the separation. So I'll just go back. We can go back to the course profile, I hope. Whoop. Great computer. So going back to the course profile, you start from North Star and you run out to Truckee, starting in North Star, running out to Truckee. and there's some bumps along there. And then as you go along 89, there's actually climbs along 89 that would allow you a group to get away before you get to the junction of 89 out towards Sierraville, which then becomes dead flat. So you run out across the flats for about 20K or so, and then you have to go back up that main climb just like the 15, 16s and back in the same way. So as we go forward and we look at the, okay, so if we look forward to the U23 and the Pro 1 men, it's basically the same issue as the 124K route. The only difference is you have a longer flat section when you get out to Sierraville. So very flat out there. There are a couple of added elements, especially in these later races, is that this time of year, there's usually thunderstorms, and it can be cold, it can be hailing in the afternoons out there. I've been on the 267 right at North Star and been hailed on and gotten off of the road because it's been that bad, and just waited out. There's big thunder cells. You can see them first thing in the morning. You will see them coming. You will know you will know what's going to happen the day of the event, but you won't know the day before. It'll be the morning of. Your guys may want to be carrying rain jackets or vests or something like that, especially in this in the U23 1 Pro race, which starts late. Is they're going to be running out there late in the afternoon. The other thing is when you get out to Sierraville later in the day, the wind comes up, so it could be dramatically windy across that flat section, which could allow for separations out on those roads. Some of those roads are fairly narrow out there, and so you may want to take a look at it and see what the wind conditions are later in the day. It's completely different later in the day than in the morning on those roads out around this loop out around Sierraville. So just keep that in mind. So the sample itinerary for the road race, and I just throw this out there for people, especially the ones that haven't done this before. If the managers and things, this is all old hat. You want to get up early, get to your registration, which is at North Star, maybe go for an easy ride. Some people actually go for a ride before they actually do the race. Get lunch in you, get to the course a reasonable time ahead, roll around maybe, get rid of the pre-race jitters, take your last bathroom break, get in the staging area, 3 o'clock at showtime, race is over by 7 o'clock. Make sure you get food in you immediately. You've got more races coming up in the upcoming days. Get yourself hydrated, do a cool down ride, back to housing, maybe get picked up en route, do post-ride food, and then maybe come back to the awards dinner, and then you know, you want to get dinner by 9. And this seems like it may not be feasible to get back to the awards. Maybe you end up skipping the awards and just go straight to dinner. Dinner's more important than awards in this case, I would say. Okay, so then the TT courses. They're very, very fast. It's one of the fastest courses in the nation. It's great. I'm glad that they're using it. They had listed Cisco Grove. That would have been a nightmare. But they're talking about using the Sierraville courses, 10K straight out and back for the little kids, 20K. You go out the same road, goes out a little further. You got to make a left, make the turnaround just to make distance. And then the 40K, it's longer, follows the same kind of route. There is a potential for wind in the afternoon, like I was talking about, and so it can be a little buffeting. So you might want to have both discs and deep dish wheels and make your decisions after you kind of see what the conditions are like. One person that you may want to get in touch with is this guy here, Kevin Metcalf. Kevin Metcalf has been riding that course since about 1983, and these are his times over kind of that time span, and you can see that his times are consistently very fast, and into the sub 50 range for a 40K. So it's a very, very fast course, and it would be very cool to see a new national record set up there. So moving forward, for the time trial, on Thursday, I put in here, is that you would get a solid for, a U23 that's going to go off, the next day. Is you would get solid breakfast in you, do some sort of recovery ride in the morning, do lunch, drive out to the course, do a recon of the course at about the time that you're racing, check your TT bike on a jig, make sure it's going to pass requirements, make any alterations you need to, make sure it's working, get an early dinner, do a post-dinner ride cruise, go to bed. Next morning, get up, have a solid breakfast, do recovery ride, lunch, basically same thing as the day before. Maybe ride your road bike out towards the course, or even your TT bike. Meet the team, get your TT bike. You're starting at 6 o'clock in the afternoon. Maybe it's hailing. Who knows? Then you finish your warm-up on your TT bike, post-TT, immediate post-ride nutrition, cool-down ride. You're in the freaking boondocks out there. I don't know how you're going to get back to North Star for awards. Get dinner by 9 o'clock. Make sure you got reservations somewhere, and then get to bed. You've got more stuff coming up. Criterium course, it's 1K, flat and fast. It's potentially technical. It's kind of a weird L-shaped course with a couple long straightaways, one really, really long straightaway. Could be kind of like a drag race, dead flat. So again, you're going to have a day in between. The little kids, not so much. They get kind of squashed in there a little bit, so they have to do some back-to-back racing. So you want to look over that if you have little kids racing, that you're going to have to modify the itinerary. You want to make sure to evaluate that crit course if you can get on it. Based on what I know of Truckee, a lot of those roads are crappy. This is a kind of a ski town area, and a lot of those things have potholes in them. You want to take a look at the course. Make sure to get a race prep in you the day before the race, get an early dinner, get to bed. Next morning, get up, do a warm-up ride, do the race, get food in you, make sure you get a proper cool down, head over to North Star for awards, then have a team celebration dinner. Even if you didn't win anything, at least you survived the week. It's a great experience. And the next day, do not forget your recovery ride. You will feel like garbage if you just jump in the car and drive home. Do not do that. Get on the bike, do a recovery ride before you leave town, and then get in the car about 1 o'clock and then drive for home. And then, just recently there was actually an accident of a rider trying to come to Redlands, and she was killed because she tried to drive overnight. And so I do not recommend that. I've done those types of drives, and I've nearly had accidents myself from doing things like that. So I do not recommend driving at night. Just pull over, get a hotel for the night. Costs you $100, but you're going to be safe. So parting thoughts on high altitude training. It's best used during the preparatory phases. There are risks associated with it. It doesn't work for everyone. It may only perform small amounts of gain for low altitude training. It can have large costs, and you need to weigh those against the real or perceived benefits of each of the types of things that you're doing. Now, in the case of going to high altitude and doing the events that you're going to be doing at nationals, is that the idea is that doing something is better than nothing at all. And so if the earlier you can get up there, the better. 14 days is the best. But if you can get up and do intermittent hypoxic exposures or high altitude tents and things like that, those can help too. So let me see if I can get in and see if there's any questions right now. Let's see, I'm trying to get over. So if anybody posts something on the whatever this is, the Google Plus channel, I'll be able to see it, and then I can address it directly. I will give people 30 seconds to start putting things in. Otherwise, I will call it good, and you can try to get a hold of me through my email or through this site, which actually sends me things, and then I can address them back on the site in the future. Well, if there's no questions at the moment, I really want to thank everybody for coming, and I hope this helps you for the national championships. And as you think about how you're preparing for the national championships, feel free to send me an email or post something to the site, and I will get it, and we can address it then. Thank you for coming, and have a good night. Let's see if I can turn it off.